Just like a friend from back home.
This is your Filipino radio experience in Las Vegas. PHLV Radio.
PHLV Radio.
Okay. Happy Tuesday or Travel Tuesday to everyone, and welcome to another episode of Smart People Travel Wise, a platform where we discuss all things about travel. I'm your host, Tenny Samagi, coming to you live here in my house in New York City, Queens to be exact. And it's a beautiful Tuesday as we're going to discuss the rise in the popularity of South Korea. I know many of us Filipinos and non-Filipinos are secretly Korean culture fans, mainly K-pop, K-dramas, even the Korean barbecue. So this episode is dedicated to all of you, as me and my fellow guests, we're going to discover what South Korea has to offer and why it's a popular tourist destination. But before I introduce you to my guests, I'd like to tell our viewers, if you are watching us live, please hashtag live. And if you are watching on replay, hashtag replay. Make sure you tell us where you're coming from so that we can acknowledge all of you. Don't forget to like us on Facebook and YouTube. And you can also tune in on iHeartRadio, Spotify, where else? Amazon Fire, or you can simply download the PHLV radio app available on all iOS and Android phones. So let's get down to today's topic is to discover South Korea. And I'd like to introduce to you my guest who actually spent a month in South Korea. He grew up a military kid, having lived in Virginia, Colorado, Japan, and California. He majored in Japanese literature and languages at the University of Colorado Boulder. And from there, he spent 2 years teaching English for the JET program in Japan, which is something that I'm considering doing next year. And John McMillen, who is my guest for today, has spent over 7 years studying the cultures of Asia, simply Japan and Korea, and which led him to his current job for Inside Travel Group as a traveling marketing manager. He's also held a position he was also a former travel consultant and business development manager. So I like to let's smash those heart buttons and let's welcome John McMillen to the podcast. Hey, John, or what is hello in Korean, by the way?
안녕하세요.
안녕하세요. I think
안녕하세요.
안녕하세요. Okay, that's something that's
Very
my
good.
first Korean. I know when I attended the webinar, you had mentioned it, and I did pretty well. But then, all is lost after 2 weeks. But 안녕하세요, John, and welcome to our podcast. And let's share to our viewers, how did you get into how did you get into the travel industry?
That's a great question. I guess I'd have to start off by saying I basically grew up traveling from the time I was about 7 and continued on through all of my younger years, visiting various places around the US, visiting various places around Asia. And that really became solidified when I was living in Japan as a kid. And so I was able to go around the country a lot, go around the region a lot. And it really got me into travel. And so that's when I got the bug and I just couldn't stop. So after graduating from university, I continued on that trend, traveling around, exploring, adventuring. I really like hiking and I really like experiencing new places, new culture, new foods, of course. And then after coming back from teaching, I was kind of on the lookout for a way to get back into doing that as a living. And then around 2013, I joined Inside Travel Group as a travel consultant for Japan specifically, and then branched out from there. So I was introduced to the company through a friend in the local community here in Denver, and was basically hired on about 6 months after she was, and have been here ever since. So absolutely love it.
I think whenever I talk to people in the travel industry, they simply love their job, and because they love travel so much that when they discover that their love for travel, they want to do it for the rest of their lives, which is what I'm trying to do too for the rest of my life. For the next maybe 20 years. I'm 42 right now. I started it a little bit too late in life, but it was probably the perfect time. And you know, you did I did mention that you taught in Japan for 2 years. How was that experience like teaching English in another country, which is it's a very trending thing to do nowadays.
Yeah, it was an absolutely incredible experience. I had lived abroad before that, so I was already used to or familiar with, culture shock and how to adapt and assimilate in a different culture, that sort of thing. It may be a little bit different for me than for some others teaching English in foreign countries, in that I already spoke some of the language when I went. But obviously, there, when you're teaching, you're meant to be an example and a model of, the language you're teaching. And so you actually don't end up using, the language of the destination country as much as you might think, or you might not need it as much as you think. Um, but, I think what the most amazing part about teaching in Japan, or teaching English abroad anywhere really, is that you really get an opportunity to be integrated into local communities, learn what people in that area do, become part of their lives, they become part of your life, and of course it enables you to explore endlessly. Every day is an adventure, everything is new, everything is really interesting and fun and delicious. So not a day goes by that I don't miss, kind of the daily discovery of living abroad, and, the challenge of communicating in a foreign language for the folks that you're around, and kind of instilling those skills into a community, that kind of thing. Very, very cool. So highly recommend it to anyone who's interested.
That's great. And then they also, you also experienced culture shock. And also when you come back to America, you just realize, oh, wow, so many people, like when you immerse into a different culture other than the American culture, you realize that, wow, it kind of shapes you to be a more respectable, kinder person. I mean, that's how I felt every time whenever I traveled. And I studied abroad in Italy, and that was, I mean, that was even kind of like not a culture shock, but it's just more of like, oh wow, people are kinder outside of America, or I'm just saying maybe kinder outside New York City. Would you say that your experience teaching abroad has kind of shaped you differently culturally?
I think one of the main advantages or main things you gain from experiences like that is patience. You do not necessarily have the skills in either language to navigate conversations like you normally would, or kind of get through daily life, that sort of thing. So a lot of times you kind of learn to go with the flow, accept things that are out of your control, and also get a spirit, or gain a spirit of being able to learn the things that you want to be able to control more. So, you really have to do things intentionally, I think, living abroad and teaching abroad, that sort of thing. So, yeah, those are probably two of the biggest things that I developed, I would say, intentionally developed while living abroad, for sure.
Now let's get into our topic today is South Korea, and you spent 1 month in the country, and South Korea is probably, I would say, in a lot of people's bucket list nowadays, thanks to BTS and K beauty and K dramas. I know I work with middle school kids, and the funny thing, one of my students said like she wants to learn 7 languages, and one of them is Korean because of thanks to BTS. But um, spending a month in Korea, how is that experience? What was that experience like?
So I think getting to Korea finally, I think I had waited too long to do it, to be honest. I had been, within striking distance of the country for, a lot of my life and, had never made the jump across the sea there. So it was kind of like a dream come true. I've been kind of like watching the development of South Korea for decades now, it seems. Um, but watching kind of the rise of the Hallyu, the Korean wave, the kind of ubiquitous Korean culture engine that's spreading across the planet. I too have seen the K dramas and have listened to the music and have grown my interest and developed my own interest. And so finally being able to get there was absolutely phenomenal. And it was full of you know satisfying discoveries and surprises and it was everything that I hoped that it would be, right? I think that's kind of maybe the take home for folks that, like you said, have it on their bucket list. It delivers on every level.
I mean, I'm sure it delivers, especially in food. There's UNESCO sites, but I'm wondering, because you also lived in Japan, you lived in Japan, and they say like, oh, there is there any similar? What are the similarities and the differences between the two countries in terms of culture, ambiance?
That's a very good one that for anyone who's been to one country or the other, you can't help noticing or comparing. And you're absolutely right as well. There is a long-standing rivalry between the two countries, and it's palpable when you're there. The history is recent. We're talking World War II and before. Kind of with most recent kind of competitions. I mean, now of course most things are competed across business and economics and that kind of thing, manufacturing between the two countries, but long-standing history with each other, of course, over the centuries and millennia. But kind of to the second part of your question, what are the similarities and differences that you might see? Well, Korea and Japan both have a lot of influence historically from China. So, a lot of the architectural styles that you'll see across the country are reminiscent or very similar between. Naturally, everything in Korea has its own flair and its own design to it. All the kind of traditional buildings have that really vibrant coloration across all types of, palaces or, the shrines and the temples and everything across the country. Whereas Japan, everything would be a little bit more subdued color-wise, even though, you still have those kind of tiled roofs and the sweeping kind of rafters of the buildings and that kind of thing. There's the kind of chain of influence, originated in China, several thousand years ago, kind of moved into Korea and then passed on to Japan from Korea. So in a sense, Korea was a bit of a bestower of traditional culture onto Japan. In a way. And there's probably people that would argue with me about that. There's always kind of ways to talk back and forth about these things. But, the truth is that, there's a lot of similar influence between the three countries, of course. One thing that's dissimilar, the languages are quite different between Japanese and Korean. I speak Japanese. I tried to speak just a little bit of Korean. It's kind of like a language I would like to learn. I love languages. I can say there is a similar thread between the two languages from those Chinese roots. Korean grammar, that sort of thing, is very much unique to its own language. But it does have a lot of words that influence the language, sort of like we might have Latin words that influence the English language, similar in Korean with Chinese. So, those are some things. I found the food in Korea to be quite different from food in Japan. I'm sure we'll probably get into that in a little bit. But, in terms of kind of orderliness, cleanliness, ease of transportation, those sorts of things are very similar between Korea and Japan. It's a breeze getting around. It's very satisfying to travel across the country through various means of transportation, whether it's bus or train or taxi. It's just very easy and fun to get around.
That's great to know. And there's even like differences in because I'm really into skincare thanks to K Beauty. I love both K Beauty and J Beauty. I mean, what K Beauty does the whole 10 steps, and then J Beauty is just like minimalism. And it's the same concept, the goal for the beauty of those two beauty regimens is, to get clear skin.
Right.
Like that's also kind of like the similarities in their cult and differences in their cultures. But let's ask about I want to ask you about South Korea and the regions. So let's break it down. The I guess the geographical map of South Korea. Obviously, South Korea is the country that we're allowed to visit. And it's
Yes.
not a communist country. That's the northern side. But where is the main hub of South Korea for travelers to enter?
Right. So we can't start this discussion without discussing Seoul, Korea. A little bit down from the DMZ, the border between North and South Korea. It's a port city with a major river going through it, the Han River, and folks are going to be flying into Incheon Airport generally, and it's about 30 or 40 minutes outside central Seoul. So, I think Seoul is a city that before you get there, you may not quite realize how large and sprawling it is. There's kind of like a full, huge part of the city above or north of the Han River, and then the Gangnam part of the city, which is south of the river. And both are kind of expanding seemingly endlessly as, the manufacturing and the kind of standard of living and the GDP raise in the country. Seoul is an ever growing city. So it not only does it have those really iconic palaces and temples of the past dotted throughout the city, but it also has, high tech industry and business, and, as well as completely modern transportation. And of course, endless places to eat and museums to visit and street art, sculpture everywhere. It's seemingly, anywhere you go around any corner, there's going to be, beautiful things to look at. And all design is done intentionally with outside buildings and indoors. It's just a joy visually to be around and go around the city. And you could spend weeks and never get bored.
Seoul, which is the capital city of South Korea. What would you suggest for like maybe a first time traveler? How many days should they spend in the capital city? And what are the main, I should say, the popular tourist spots in Seoul and probably maybe outside of the capital city?
Yeah, great. So I would absolutely recommend spending a minimum of 3 full days in Seoul. That's, as I say, a minimum. And what that would enable you to see, you'd be able to see some of the traditional palaces. There are five. So, those are all well worth visiting, but you could at least be able to see a few of them within that time frame. It would allow you to do a DMZ tour. That would be kind of a partial day or majority of a day trip out to spots along the demilitarized zone. Now, you're not necessarily going and seeing military members from North Korea on that trip, but what you'd be hearing is the kind of stories of the guide and the people who have, lived through that conflict, that sort of thing. So you'd be experiencing part of the modern history, basically, of the area. I highly recommend it to anyone who has any interest at all in modern history. So definitely a must do in my eyes when you're in Seoul. Another great thing to do in the city is to go to the food markets. So there are several dotted across the city. A lot of them are on the northern half. Outdoor markets that have multiple stalls, with all manner of traditional foods kind of heaped up on, giant platters and cooking devices, and just anybody from all walks of lives, flow into these food markets and arcades, and you can just wander through and try anything that you like to try, and have a couple drinks and that kind of thing. So really, really a joy to experience those food markets. If you can't tell, I love food. So
Oh,
really,
don't we
really
all?
a good, great.